A 12-year-old paperboy vanished on a quiet suburban street. More than 40 years later, people are still arguing about what happened to him. Some believe he was abducted. Some believe he became the victim of something far larger. And some claims surrounding this case are so controversial that investigators still debate them today. But before the theories, before the headlines, before one of the most discussed missing child cases in American history, there was only a boy named Johnny Gosch, and a newspaper route he never finished. It was just after 6 a.m. on September 5, 1982. Johnny was delivering newspapers in West Des Moines, Iowa, something he had done countless times before. His red wagon rolled behind him. His dog wandered nearby. The neighborhood was already awake. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, within a matter of minutes, everything changed. Later, witnesses would remember small details that suddenly felt important. A strange car moving slowly through the area. A man who stopped to ask Johnny for directions. Another figure standing nearby, watching. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Why would they? It was a quiet Sunday morning in suburbia. The kind of place where children were expected to come home. But Johnny never did. His newspaper wagon was eventually found abandoned. The papers were still inside. His dog returned home alone. Johnny was gone. No scream. No struggle. No clear explanation for how a 12-year-old boy could disappear in broad daylight from a neighborhood filled with witnesses. And that's what continues to haunt this case. Because someone saw something that morning. Maybe several people did. But whatever happened during those missing minutes has never been fully explained. And the deeper you go into the disappearance of Johnny Gosch, the stranger the story becomes. West Des Moines, Iowa, 1982. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where kids spent entire afternoons outside without anyone worrying too much about where they were. Safe. At least, that was how it felt. And in many ways, Johnny Gosch was exactly the kind of kid that neighborhood was built for. Johnny was 12 years old, the youngest child in the Gosch family. Friendly, energetic, and easy to like. Teachers remembered a polite student. Neighbors knew him as the paperboy who delivered newspapers before most people had even finished their first cup of coffee. Like many boys his age, Johnny lived somewhere between childhood and independence. He loved football, played drums in the school band, built model rockets, and was constantly finding new hobbies to obsess over. One week it might be computers. The next, architecture or some project he wanted to build in the garage. He rarely sat still for long. Most of all, Johnny loved being outside. He spent hours with friends racing go-karts, building snow forts during Iowa winters, and exploring the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. Life felt wide open. For nearly a year, Johnny had been delivering newspapers for the Des Moines Register. The job meant more than a little extra money. It meant responsibility. Freedom. A chance to prove he was growing up. He was already saving for something he desperately wanted. A bright yellow Yamaha dirt bike. Not because someone was going to buy it for him. Because he planned to earn it himself. At first, his father accompanied him on the route. But lately, Johnny had been doing more of it alone. He wanted the independence. He wanted to show he could handle things on his own, and everyone around him believed he could. Customers trusted him. Neighbors trusted him. His parents trusted him. Even the small things reflected the kind of kid Johnny was. Years later, his mother Noreen would remember how carefully he chose gifts for family members. He never grabbed the first thing he saw. He wanted people to feel special. That was just who he was. 2 days before he disappeared, the family sat together watching Johnny's older brother play football. Nothing felt unusual. Johnny laughed with his family, cheered from the stands, talked about school, football, and everything else a 12-year-old boy was supposed to be thinking about. The new school year had only just begun. The future seemed full of ordinary plans. And maybe that's why the morning of September 5, 1982 felt so routine. Johnny had somewhere to be before sunrise. A newspaper route he already knew by heart. Customers waiting for their papers. A neighborhood that seemed completely safe. No one in the Gosch family could have imagined that within a few hours, police officers, neighbors, and volunteers would be searching those same streets for their son. Because on that Sunday morning, Johnny wasn't supposed to become a missing child. He was supposed to finish his route. He was supposed to come home for breakfast. And like everyone else in West Des Moines, he had no reason to believe that morning would be any different from all the ones that came before it. Sunday, September 5th, 1982. West Des Moines was still dark when Johnny Gosch woke up. Most of the neighborhood was asleep. Porch lights glowed quietly along 45th Street. The streets were empty except for the paperboys who had already started moving toward their routes. Sometime before 6 a.m., Johnny left the house. This time, he went alone. He did not wake his father to come with him the way he sometimes had before. He simply got dressed, took Gretchen, the family's little dachshund, and headed into the early morning darkness with his newspaper wagon. He was wearing a white sweatshirt, warm-up pants, and blue flip-flops. Ordinary clothes, for an ordinary route. At the newspaper drop-off point near the church, other paperboys were already gathering and sorting their bundles. Then a car pulled up. Several boys later described it as a two-tone blue Ford Fairmont. The driver asked for directions to 86th Street. It was a simple question, the kind of thing that might not have seemed unusual in the moment. But according to later accounts, Johnny appeared uneasy afterward. One report said he told another boy he was scared and wanted to go home. Whether everyone understood the significance of that moment at the time is another question. Because within minutes, Johnny's route would begin to fall apart. Some witnesses later recalled the car remaining nearby. Others reported seeing another man in the area. Taller, quieter, moving in a way that drew attention only after everyone realized Johnny was gone. There were small details. A car door. A vehicle leaving quickly. A few seconds that people would replay in their minds for years. But no one saw the full picture. By the time the morning paper route should have been underway, Johnny had vanished. His red newspaper wagon was found near 42nd Street and Marcourt Lane, still full of papers, untouched. Gretchen eventually made her way back home without him, but Johnny did not. There was no clear sign of a struggle, no confirmed scream, no trail leading away from the wagon, just a quiet residential street and a paper route that had suddenly stopped in the middle. For a while, no one at home knew anything was wrong. Then the phone rang. A customer was calling to complain that the newspaper had not been delivered. Johnny's father went out to check the route himself. What he found was not a delayed paperboy. It was the wagon, the papers, the dog, and the terrifying realization that his son had disappeared somewhere between home and a route he knew by heart. Police were called, but from the beginning, the first hours of the case were marked by confusion, delay, and conflicting accounts of what witnesses believed they had seen. A strange car, a man asking for directions, possibly another figure nearby, an abandoned wagon, a dog that came home alone. Investigators had pieces, but not enough to explain how a 12-year-old boy disappeared from his own neighborhood before breakfast. And by the time everyone understood this, was not a simple runaway. Those first crucial minutes were already gone. By the time police began treating Johnny Gosch's disappearance as a serious missing child case, investigators were no longer looking for a boy who had wandered off. They were trying to explain how a 12-year-old paperboy could vanish from his own neighborhood before breakfast. The first problem was obvious. There had been witnesses. Several paperboys reported seeing a two-tone Ford Fairmont near the newspaper drop-off point that morning. Others remembered a stocky man asking for directions. Some described another figure in the area shortly before Johnny disappeared. None of the accounts perfectly matched, but together they painted a troubling picture. Something unusual had happened on Johnny's route. Investigators collected statements, compared descriptions, and searched for the vehicle. Nothing came of it. No suspect was identified. No arrest was made. And despite the number of people who had been awake that morning, nobody could explain where Johnny had gone. As the hours turned into days, search efforts expanded across West Des Moines. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. Tracking dogs searched fields, parks, wooded areas, drainage ditches, and open land surrounding the city. The FBI eventually became involved. But every search ended the same way. No trail, no clothing, no body, no answers. For Johnny's family, the frustration grew quickly. They believed valuable time had been lost during the earliest stages of the investigation. Police had initially considered the possibility that Johnny was a runaway, a theory his parents found impossible to accept. Johnny had left behind his newspapers, his wagon, his route. His dog had returned home without him. Nothing about the scene suggested a child who had chosen to disappear. Weeks became months. Months became years. And the case slowly began drifting into the place every family fears most. A mystery with no clear direction. Then, in August 1984, it happened again. Another Des Moines area paperboy vanished. His name was Eugene Martin. He was 13 years old. Like Johnny, he disappeared during an early morning newspaper route. Like Johnny, he seemed to vanish without a trace. The similarities terrified parents throughout Iowa and reignited questions about Johnny's case. Was there a connection? Was someone targeting paperboys? Or was it a coincidence too disturbing to ignore? Public pressure intensified. Criticism of law enforcement grew louder. Many people argued that missing children were not being treated with enough urgency during the first critical hours after a disappearance. Out of that frustration came lasting change. Iowa lawmakers passed what became known as the Johnny Gosch bill, requiring law enforcement to respond immediately to reports of missing children rather than waiting for arbitrary time periods to pass. The law would eventually influence procedures far beyond Iowa. But for Johnny, the change came too late. Meanwhile, his photograph spread across America. Johnny became one of the first missing children featured on milk cartons, turning his face into a national symbol of a growing crisis. Millions of people saw him. Millions recognized his name. Yet year after year, investigators found themselves facing the same reality. No physical evidence. No confirmed suspect. No explanation. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more difficult it became to separate credible leads from false hope. Sightings poured in from across the country. Most collapsed under scrutiny. Others led nowhere. Some people even tried to profit from the family's desperation. In 1985, a man named Robert Meyer contacted Johnny's mother claiming he knew what had happened to her son and demanding money for information. The story eventually unraveled, and Meyer was exposed as a fraud. For Johnny Gosch, it was another cruel reminder that hope could be manipulated. By the late 1980s, the investigation appeared to be running out of road. No evidence had emerged. No suspect had been charged. And Johnny Gosch remained missing. Then, in 1989, a young man came forward with a story that would change the direction of the case forever. His name was Paul Bonacci. And according to him, Johnny Gosch's disappearance was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. For 7 years, investigators had searched for suspects, vehicles, and physical evidence. Then Paul Bonacci introduced something entirely different, a story. And for more than 3 decades, almost every argument surrounding the disappearance of Johnny Gosch has eventually led back to him. In 1989, Bonacci came forward with a story that sounded less like a witness statement and more like a nightmare. He claimed that Johnny had not been abducted by a lone predator. He claimed multiple people were involved. According to Bonacci, Johnny had been taken as part of an organized child exploitation network operating far beyond Iowa. It was a shocking allegation, and it immediately divided the case into 2 completely different realities. In one version of the story, Paul Bonacci was telling the truth. In the other, he wasn't. The problem is that neither possibility is easy to dismiss. Supporters of Bonacci point to details that continue to raise uncomfortable questions. He described physical characteristics of Johnny that were not widely known to the public, including a distinctive birthmark and an unusual scar on his tongue. To Johnny's mother, Noreen, that mattered. A lot. Because if Bonacci had never met Johnny, how did he know those things? But critics point to an equally troubling problem. Bonacci's history was complicated. His statements changed over time. Some investigators questioned his credibility entirely. Members of his own family claimed he was at home when Johnny disappeared. Law enforcement never accepted his account as proof, and no physical evidence ever emerged to confirm what he described, which leaves the case trapped in an uncomfortable place. Bonacci may have known too much, or he may have convinced people he did, and depending on which side you believe, the entire meaning of Johnny's disappearance changes. Because if Bonacci was right, then Johnny was never simply taken by one offender. He became part of something much larger, something organized, something hidden, something capable of surviving for years without being exposed. That theory eventually became linked to allegations surrounding the Franklin Credit Union scandal in neighboring Nebraska. A case involving accusations of child abuse, trafficking, and political protection. Some researchers believed the two stories intersected. Others argued the connection was built almost entirely on speculation. To this day, no court has ever established a direct link between the Franklin allegations and Johnny's disappearance. Yet the connection refuses to disappear. And that's what makes the theory so powerful. Not because it has been proven, because it hasn't. It's powerful because it offers an explanation for something that otherwise seems impossible. How does a 12-year-old boy vanish from a suburban neighborhood and leave almost nothing behind? But there is another theory, one that requires far fewer moving parts. Maybe the answer isn't a hidden network. Maybe it was one offender, one vehicle, one opportunity. Investigators have long considered the possibility that Johnny was abducted by a lone predator, someone familiar with the area, someone who noticed a child delivering newspapers before sunrise, someone who knew exactly how little time they would have. That theory is simpler, cleaner, and in some ways more believable. But it comes with its own problems. If a lone offender was responsible, who was he? Why was he never identified? And how did he avoid leaving behind evidence for more than 40 years? Then there are the cases of Eugene Martin and Mark Allen. More missing boys. More unanswered questions. More reasons for some people to believe Johnny's disappearance was never an isolated event. And yet no definitive connection has ever been established. Every path seems to break apart just before reaching a conclusion. Even some of the most publicized claims surrounding the case have collapsed under scrutiny. Over the years, rumors surfaced that Johnny had been seen living under another identity. One conspiracy theory even claimed he had grown up to become a well-known political journalist. The evidence never held up. The theory eventually fell apart, but the fact that people were willing to believe it says something important about this case. After decades without answers, people began searching for Johnny everywhere, because the truth remained hidden nowhere, and everywhere. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question in the entire investigation. Not whether Johnny Gosch disappeared. Not whether he was abducted. But whether anyone has ever come closer to the truth than they realized. Because years after Paul Bonacci made his claims, something happened that convinced Noreen Gosch she finally had her answer. Or at least, part of it.
We love you. We're waiting for you to come home. We're doing everything in our power to get you back. Take care, babe.
Thousands of people have been searching for the boy, but nothing positive has turned up.
The pain and angst that goes with never having any kind of closure to this case.
Now the Iowa State Patrol captain has agreed to display the wagon and its history at the patrol spot inside the grandstand at the Iowa State Fair.
One would really hope that that would cause someone to maybe have information in this case that would be able to be of use.
Logston and Sampson will never forget the day Gosch disappeared. They want to make sure the rest of Iowa doesn't forget either.
Anybody who sees that at the fair, whether they know the story or not, if they don't get the chills or get choked up, they better check their pulse.
Most missing child cases eventually become a battle against time. Johnny Gosch became a battle against certainty. By the 1990s, investigators, journalists, private researchers, and Johnny's family were no longer arguing about what evidence existed. They were arguing about what the evidence meant. And those are two very different things. Because over the years, the case accumulated something unusual. Not answers. Stories. Stories that sounded possible. Stories that sounded impossible. Stories that sat somewhere in between. Then, in March 1997, one of those stories became impossible to ignore. According to Noreen Gosch, she was awakened around 2:30 in the morning by a knock at her front door. When she opened it, she later claimed she saw her son standing there. Johnny would have been 27 years old. Noreen said he was accompanied by another man she did not recognize. She said they spoke inside the house for more than an hour. According to her account, Johnny told her he had been forced into a child exploitation network after his abduction and could not safely return to his former life. Then he left and disappeared again. The story immediately became one of the most controversial chapters in the entire case. Not because people didn't believe Noreen, because many believed that she sincerely believed what she experienced. The problem was something else. There was no proof, no photographs, no recordings, no independent witness, no physical evidence capable of confirming what happened inside that house. Only a mother's testimony. And that became the dividing line. Some people saw the visit as the closest anyone had ever come to the truth. Others saw it as the tragic result of 15 years of grief colliding with hope. The gap between those two possibilities has never closed. Years later, another mystery appeared. In 2006, Noreen discovered an anonymous package left outside her home containing photographs of bound children. She believed one of the boys resembled Johnny. Investigators eventually traced some of the images to unrelated cases and older material from Florida. Yet even then, the questions never fully disappeared. Because once doubt enters a case, certainty becomes difficult to recover. And Johnny Gosch's story became filled with doubt. There were witnesses, but no complete account. There were suspects, but no charges. There were theories, but no conclusion. There were sightings, but no verification. There were stories that sounded unbelievable, and facts that sounded unbelievable too. Somewhere along the way, the case stopped behaving like a traditional missing child investigation. It became something stranger. A puzzle where every piece seemed to come from a different box. Even today, people can look at the same information and arrive at completely different conclusions. Some see evidence of a larger hidden crime. Others see decades of rumors attaching themselves to an unsolved disappearance. Neither side has been able to prove its case completely. And maybe that's what makes Johnny Gosch different from so many other missing children. Most mysteries leave behind missing pieces. This one leaves behind too many. Too many witnesses, too many claims, too many possibilities. And somehow, still not enough certainty. 40 years later, the most important question is no longer whether Johnny disappeared. Everyone agrees that he did. The real question is why every path toward an answer seems to dissolve just before reaching the truth. Because after all these years, investigators still don't know what happened to Johnny Gosch. His family doesn't know. The public doesn't know. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all is that somewhere inside this case, the truth has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Hidden beneath decades of noise, waiting for someone to recognize it. Today, more than 4 decades after he disappeared, Johnny Gosch remains officially missing. No one has ever been charged. No suspect has ever been identified. And no definitive explanation has ever emerged for what happened on that September morning in 1982. If Johnny is still alive, he would be 56 years old in 2026. Older now than his parents were when they first began searching for him. That fact alone feels almost impossible to process. Because for many people, Johnny still exists as he appeared in the photographs that covered milk cartons, telephone poles, and missing person posters across America. A 12-year-old boy carrying newspapers before sunrise, frozen in time, while everyone else grew older. For Johnny's family, however, time never truly moved on. Noreen Gosch spent decades refusing to let her son's name disappear. She gave interviews, spoke at conferences, worked with victims' organizations, created foundations dedicated to missing and exploited children, and pushed for changes that transformed how law enforcement responds to missing child cases. What began as a search for one boy eventually became a fight for countless others. In that sense, Johnny's disappearance changed America. Not because the mystery was solved, because it wasn't, but because families after Johnny no longer had to hear the same words so many parents heard in the past: wait 72 hours. His case helped force a different conversation. One that treated missing children as emergencies from the very beginning, and yet for all the awareness, all the media coverage, all the documentaries, all the investigations, the central question remains untouched. What happened to Johnny Gosch? Somewhere over the years, the case became larger than the boy himself. People debated theories, argued over witnesses, fought over competing narratives, tried to connect dots stretching across decades. But beneath all of that is a much simpler reality. A child left home to deliver newspapers and never came back. Everything else came later. The theories, the headlines, the controversy, the books, the documentaries, the endless arguments. At its core, the story has always been about a family that never got an answer. And perhaps that's why the case continues to resonate after so many years. Not because it is the strangest, not because it is the most sensational, but because it captures a fear that feels universal. The fear that someone you love can disappear in a matter of minutes and leave behind questions that survive for generations. Somewhere the truth still exists, maybe in a witness who never realized what they saw, maybe in a memory someone dismissed decades ago, maybe in information that has yet to come forward, or maybe in a place no one has thought to look. Until that truth is found, Johnny Gosch remains more than a cold case. He remains a missing child. And after all these years, that distinction still matters. If you believe someone, somewhere, still knows what happened to Johnny Gosch, don't let the conversation end here. Because time may turn investigations cold, but sometimes the answer survives, waiting for the right person to finally speak. And for one family in Iowa, that hope has never completely disappeared.